An HOA official pointed a gun at my wife. You won't believe what happened next. That man ran away so fast, you'd think his life was on the line. My wife, Sarah, and I thought we had found the perfect place to live when we moved into our new suburban neighborhood. It seemed like a dream with its neat lawns and white picket fences. But then we came across Frank Miller. He acted like he was the sheriff of the community, running the place like it was his own little kingdom. Our trouble with him started over something small, to blue flower pots. That simple decoration led to a crazy $500 fine, but what Frank didn't realize was that he made a big mistake. He had no idea what my wife really did for a living. Her job is to train people for the most intense situations imaginable. This story gets wild very quickly. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from. Sarah and I had just settled into our perfect suburban home we thought we had found. True peace, we were so innocent. On our second weekend there, Sarah put some beautiful blue flower pots on our front porch. They were a stunning deep blue color that looked great against our white house. One morning, I was outside enjoying my coffee and looking at the pots when I heard a golf cart coming. It was Frank Miller. He was about 50 years old and had a mustache that just screamed, "I'm a very serious person." He parked his cart perfectly and walked up our porch steps as if he owned our house. "Good morning," Frank said, but his tone made it clear it was not going to be a good morning. "You're in violation of HOA Rule 7B. Only decorations that are white, beige, or light gray are allowed on the outside of houses." I almost choked on my coffee. I thought it had to be a prank. I even looked around for a hidden camera. "What is this?" I joked. "An HOA or some kind of psychology test about colors?" I was just trying to be friendly, but Frank was not amused. His face stayed completely straight. He pulled out a small notepad and started writing, just like a police officer giving a speeding ticket. "This is your first violation," he said. "The fine is $500. You have 48 hours to pay, or we will take further action." His words felt like a punch. $500 for flower pots? Are you crazy? I said, but he was already walking away, pleased that he had ruined our peaceful morning. Just then, Sarah came out onto the porch. The noise had brought her out from the kitchen where she was making breakfast. When Frank saw her, something about him changed. Sarah has a unique way of looking at people. It's a calm, thoughtful look, as if she's reading everything about them from their body language. She locked her eyes on Frank, and I saw him take a small step back. "Just pay it, honey," she said to me, but she never stopped looking at Frank. "I'll take care of this later." Her voice was cold and firm, a tone I had never heard from her before. Frank seemed to notice it too. His confidence disappeared for a second, and I saw his jaw clench. I would later find out that in that moment, Frank Miller had decided we were his enemies. In his neighborhood, no one was allowed to show him that kind of disrespect. After Frank left in his golf cart, Sarah took out her phone. I was still standing there, stunned, with my coffee in my hand. "Johnson," she said into the phone, and I was immediately curious. Who was Johnson? "I need information on a man named Frank Miller," she continued. "Yes, I'll send you the details." She hung up before I could ask any more questions. "Who's Johnson?" I asked as she went back inside. "How do you handle situations like that?" She paused and gave me a smile that was both comforting and a little scary. "I'll tell you later, honey. For now, let's just give the man his money and see what he does next." I was already wondering what my wife had just started. More than that, I was wondering who exactly I had married. What did she just do, and who was she calling? If you've ever had a neighbor who acted like they owned your house, leave a comment below. Things got much worse from there. The next morning, I was mowing the lawn, still angry about the ridiculous fine. For a minute, I had almost forgotten about Frank Miller. Then I heard his golf cart again. This time, he didn't waste any time with greetings. He drove his cart directly onto our lawn, got out, and walked toward me like he owned the whole world. Before I could figure out what was happening, he bent down and pulled the power cord right out of my lawnmower. "I'm taking this equipment because of the violation," he announced as if he were a federal agent. "You didn't pay the fine." I couldn't believe his nerve. This man had just walked onto my property and touched my things without asking. "Hey, what are you doing? Get off my property," I yelled. But Frank was already wrapping up the cord as if it were his. Something inside me snapped. I'm not a violent person, but when someone tries to take your property on your own lawn, it brings out a primal feeling. I pushed Frank, and he stumbled back. It was probably the first time in years anyone had stood up to him physically, and his reaction showed it. He pushed me. I could call the police right now. Frank shouted, but his voice was shaking, which told me he wasn't as tough as he acted. Suddenly, Sarah was there. She moved so smoothly, I had never seen anything like it. She stood between me and Frank with a look of tactical readiness. "Frank," she said, and her voice was just as cold and firm as the day before. "You are on my property without permission. You have 10 seconds to leave." The way she spoke made all of Frank's toughness disappear instantly. He looked from Sarah to me and then back to Sarah. For the first time since we met him, Frank Miller looked scared. He dropped my power cord and backed away to his golf cart. But he had to get in one last threat. "I'll remember this," he said, pointing at both of us as if we were on some kind of list. After he drove off, I stood in my front yard, my heart still racing, trying to understand what had just happened. Sarah was already calmly coiling up the power cord as if nothing was wrong. "Where did you learn to do that?" I asked. "Do what?" She replied with a smile that showed she knew exactly what I was talking about. "That thing where you made a grown man back down with just your voice." Sarah handed me the cord and went back into the house. "I've dealt with men like him before," she said casually. "He's going to escalate." The way she said it, so matter of fact, sent a shiver down my spine. Dealt with them where? What kind of work did she really do? But she was already inside, and I had more questions than ever. That afternoon, I called my dad. "Dad, this HOA guy is getting really aggressive, and I don't know what to do." My father had been in the Vietnam War and worked in construction for 40 years. He had seen his share of bullies, and his advice was simple. "Son," he said, "sometimes you have to stand up for yourself, even if you're scared, but you have to be smart about it. Don't let him push you, but don't give him a reason to get the law involved." After that talk, I felt a new sense of resolve. I wasn't going to let Frank scare us out of our own home, but I had no idea that Sarah already had her own plans, and they were much more strategic than anything I could have imagined. That night at dinner, Sarah warned me about what was coming next, and she was right. "He won't stop with the lawnmower," she said, cutting her chicken with perfect precision. "Men like Frank need to feel like they are in control, and we've challenged him twice. He will escalate because backing down would mean he's admitting he's not powerful." I watched her, amazed at how she analyzed Frank's mind, as if he were a subject in a study, not just our neighbor. "How do you know so much about how men like him think?" I asked. Sarah looked up from her plate, and for a second I saw a look in her eyes that was both familiar and completely new to me. "Experience," she said simply. "A lot of experience." She didn't say any more, but I started to understand that there were parts of my wife's life I knew nothing about. Where had my wife dealt with dangerous men before? If you think Sarah is hiding something big, let me know what you believe her. Full story is in the comments. Just as Sarah predicted, the escalation began 3 nights later. I heard sounds outside our bedroom window. It could have been anything, but Sarah's reaction told me it wasn't. When I told her I heard something, she immediately picked up her phone. "Install more cameras," she said, without any hesitation. "Trust me." Her certainty made me realize she had been expecting this. The next morning, I was at the hardware store buying a full security camera system. The clerk asked if we'd had any break-ins. "Not yet," I said, and the words gave me a chill. I was actually expecting trouble in my own home. The following night, we got the clear proof we needed that something was wrong. Our new cameras caught movement, but the video was blurry. We could see shadows moving across our lawn and a figure appearing and disappearing at the edge of our property. Sarah studied the footage like a detective. "It's him," she said with total confidence, "but we need better proof." I looked at the grainy video, confused. "How can you be so sure?" I asked. "Because I've seen this pattern before," she replied, and her tone suggested she had seen much worse than a neighbor creeping around in the dark. "Install more cameras tomorrow. We need to see every angle." Her talk of surveillance and patterns made me curious about her secret background again, but keeping our home safe felt more important. The third night, we got the evidence we were waiting for, and it was much more shocking than I ever could have guessed. At exactly 1:15 a.m., our security system sent multiple alerts to our phones. Sarah and I watched the live feed as Frank Miller, dressed in all black, came out of the shadows at the edge of our yard. He moved quietly and carefully, like someone who had done this many times before, constantly looking over his shoulder and staying close to the fence. For 10 minutes, we watched him circle our house, looking in the windows, testing the handle on our garden gate, and finally, walking up to our front door. The most frightening moment was when Frank slowly reached for our front door handle and carefully tried to turn it, checking to see if it was unlocked. This was no longer just a violation of rules. It was a clear attempt to break into our home. What made it even more disturbing happened the next morning. Our elderly neighbor, Walter, knocked on our door while walking his beagle. Walter was the neighborhood watchman, and this wasn't just a friendly visit. "I saw Miller creeping around your house last night," he said, getting straight to the point. Apparently, walking his dog at 1 a.m. was Walter's way of keeping an eye on things. "He's done this to other families, you know." The Hendersons moved out last year after he started his surveillance on them. And the Johnsons, a young couple a few streets over, they packed up and left in the middle of the night about 6 months ago. Walter's story hit me hard. Frank Miller wasn't just bothering us, he had a history of terrorizing families until they were forced to leave. Sarah invited Walter in for coffee, and he told us more. He painted a picture of a man who used his HOA power to wage a campaign of fear against anyone who stood up to him. "Frank has a system," Walter explained, petting his old dog. "First, he finds a small, expensive violation, then, if you push back, he starts watching your house, making you feel unsafe. Most people just move away," he added. "The HOA board supports him because, honestly, they're afraid of him too." I watched Sarah as she listened, taking in every word and asking sharp questions about Frank's tactics and timing. I realized she was building a psychological profile, though I still didn't understand how she was so skilled at it. After Walter left, we re-watched the security footage. Seeing Frank trying our door handle in the clear light of day was even more unsettling than watching it live. "This isn't about flower pots anymore," I said, stating what we both knew. "It never was," Sarah replied. "Frank Miller is a predator. He uses his position to scare families, and when they leave, he feels powerful. The flower pots were just his excuse to come after us." The way she analyzed Frank's mind was both impressive and scary. "You sound like you've studied this kind of behavior before," I said, hoping for more information about her past. Sarah looked at me for a long time before answering. "Some people are natural predators," she said at last, "and some people are trained to handle them. The real question is, are we going to run away like the others, or are we going to fight?" That evening, as we prepared for another night of watching the cameras, I looked at my wife in a new light. She was calm and focused, ready for a conflict that was completely out of place in our quiet suburban life. She moved around our house like a soldier, setting up a defensive line, checking all the locks and placing cameras, all with a professionalism that came from training, not fear. "Sarah," I said as she adjusted a camera angle, "what is it that you're not telling me about yourself?" She stopped what she was doing and looked at me, her expression a mix of love and caution. "After we deal with Frank Miller," she said, "I'll tell you everything. But right now, we have to make sure he doesn't escalate to something even more dangerous." The thought that things could get worse than attempted breaking and entering sent a chill through me. How many other families had Frank scared away, and what had happened to them? If this were your house, what would you do? Let me know in the comments, because this whole situation is about to come to a head. The next morning, the big confrontation happened. Sarah was in our backyard doing her daily yoga, a routine she said kept her calm and focused. I was learning that everything my wife did had a reason. She was in the middle of her yoga session, moving with a grace that came from years of practice, when Frank Miller made his most aggressive move yet. I was in the kitchen with my coffee when I saw Frank's golf cart pull up to our backyard. Instead of staying on public property or knocking on the front door, he walked right onto our lawn and went straight for my wife. "What are you doing in my yard?" Frank demanded, his voice filled with a desperate anger I hadn't heard before. Sarah finished her yoga pose before even looking at him, a display of calm that only made him angrier. "Yoga," she replied simply, without moving from her spot or showing any fear. "This is suspicious behavior," Frank yelled, his face turning. "Reed, you're spying on the neighborhood and pretending it's exercise." The accusation was so ridiculous I almost laughed, but something in Frank's eyes stopped me. He looked wild, like a man who was about to lose all control. I have the authority to investigate threats in this neighborhood, he continued, his voice getting louder, and I have the authority to defend this community from people like you. That's when Frank Miller crossed a line that changed everything. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a handgun, and pointed it directly at my wife. Time seemed to freeze. A man was pointing a loaded gun at Sarah in our own backyard, all over a yoga routine. Every part of me wanted to rush outside and protect her. But before I could even move, Sarah did something that defied all logic. She didn't scream, she didn't run, she didn't even flinch. Instead, she slowly stood up from her yoga pose and looked Frank Miller right in the eyes. Her gaze was so calm and intense that it was terrifying. "Frank," Sarah said, and her voice had completely changed. The warm, gentle tone I had known for 3 years was gone. In its place was a voice that was cold, direct, and incredibly powerful. "Lower the weapon right now." Frank's hand, holding the gun, began to shake. I couldn't tell if it was from adrenaline or pure fear. Who are you?" he stammered. For the first time, Frank Miller sounded truly afraid. Sarah took a step toward him, and impossibly, Frank took a step back, even though he was the one with the gun. "I'm someone who trains Navy SEALs how to handle people with guns who don't know what they're doing," Sarah said, her voice full of authority. "And you, Frank Miller, don't know what you're doing." The change in my wife was stunning. This wasn't the woman who made my coffee and laughed at my jokes. This was someone else entirely, someone who was trained for this exact situation. Frank's reaction was instant. The gun seemed to get heavy in his hand. His face turned pale and he started sweating. "You can single quotes you don't have the authority he started to say, but Sarah cut him off with a small, sharp gesture that made him snap his mouth shut. "The only authority that matters right now," Sarah said, "is the authority I'm giving you to walk away from this with your dignity. But that window is closing very quickly." Frank looked around wildly, as if he was looking for help that wasn't there. When he realized he was all alone, something inside him seemed to break. He lowered the gun with a shaking hand and practically ran to his golf cart. He sped away from our property like a man running from a nightmare. I stood at the kitchen window, having completely forgotten about my coffee, trying to understand what I had just seen. My wife had faced down an armed man with only her words and her presence, and she had won completely. When Sarah came back into the house, she was already starting to seem like her usual self again, but I could not forget what had just happened. "Who are you, really?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Sarah sat down at our kitchen table and looked at me with an expression that was both sorry and strong. "My real job is psychological warfare consulting for special operations units," she said. "My main clients are Navy SEALs, Special Forces, and other military units. They need to understand how to survive when they are threatened. I teach them how to read people, how to project authority, and how to win in situations where mind games are the difference between life and death." The truth hit me like a physical blow. For 3 years, I had been married to a woman who trained elite soldiers for psychological combat, and I never knew. "The corporate consulting work?" I asked. "It's real," she said, "but it's only about 20% of what I do. The other 80% is classified work with people in life or death situations." I sat down across from her, my mind spinning. "Why didn't you tell me?" Sarah's face softened, and for the first time, I saw vulnerability I had never seen before. "Leo, I've been hiding this because I just wanted a normal life with you. I'm tired of being the weapon. I just wanted to be your wife with the blue flower pots." Her admission broke my heart, but it also explained so much. "So when you said you'd handle Frank," I started. "I meant I'd handle him the way I handle all threats," Sarah finished. "By understanding his mind, finding his weaknesses, and stopping him without violence if I can." She looked at me carefully. "But Leo, what just happened changes everything." Frank Miller pulled a gun on me in our backyard. This isn't just a neighborhood issue anymore. This is a man who has completely lost control, and that makes him incredibly dangerous. Her words settled over me like a cold blanket. We weren't dealing with a petty HOA president anymore. We were dealing with someone willing to use deadly force to feel powerful, and my wife was the only thing standing between him and us. What does a Navy SEAL trainer do to stop a threat like that? Who else is wondering what Sarah is planning next? This woman does not play around. After Frank ran from our backyard, we were left to figure out our next move. I found myself at a crossroads. My first thought was to pack up and leave, just like the other families Walter told us about. It would have been the easy way out, but when I looked at my wife, who had just disarmed a gunman with her calm strength, I knew we couldn't run. No more hiding, I said, feeling a new firmness in my own voice. No more running. I'm going to research this guy myself, and we're going to put an end to this. Sarah studied my face for a moment, then nodded. Good, she said, but we do this the right way. We build a case that is so strong it can't be ignored, and we stop him completely. The next few hours changed me. I went from being a victim to being an investigator. At the local library, I looked up public records on Frank Miller. I found some disturbing, but not surprising, information. He had been fired from his last job for what was officially called interpersonal conflicts with subordinates. Reading between the lines, it was clear he was a bully who abused his power. The most important detail was the timing. He was fired in March of last year, and our HOA hired him just 2 months later, in May. This meant the HOA chairwoman, Carolyn Vance, had to have known about his past. While I was digging through records, Sarah was conducting her own, much more advanced investigation. She made calls to contacts I never knew she had, speaking in a professional tone about behavioral profiles and threat assessments. In one call one overheard, she was discussing Frank's mental state and the high probability that he would escalate to physical violence. The subject shows classic signs of displaced authority syndrome, Sarah said to someone named Johnson, the same person she had called before. He was terminated for abuse of power, and his current role gave him very little real authority. Recent challenges have made him more aggressive. I recommend immediate intervention before he becomes seriously violent. Hearing my wife talk about our neighbor like a military target was both reassuring and terrifying. By the end of the day, we had a powerful case against Frank Miller. We have the security footage of him trying to break in, his employment records showing his history of bullying, Walter's testimony about the other families, and now clear evidence that he was willing to use a gun to intimidate people. Sarah had even managed to get statements from his former co-workers who described the exact same pattern of bullying we were experiencing. This isn't just about us anymore, Sarah said as we went over all the evidence. Frank Miller is a dangerous man who has been protected by an HOA board that either didn't do its job or simply chose to look the other way. We have to stop him before he hurts someone. The plan Sarah came up with was brilliant. First, we would file a police report about the gun incident. This would create an official record of Frank's escalation. Then we would call an emergency HOA meeting to present our evidence, not just against Frank, but against the board that enabled him. The key, Sarah explained, is to make it impossible for them to downplay what happened. We're not just accusing Frank of harassment, we're proving he's a dangerous individual with a history of abusing power. And we're showing that the HOA board knew and let it happen. The strategy was perfect because it targeted both the immediate threat, Frank, and the larger problem that allowed him to terrorize people. What struck me the most was how Sarah prepared me for my role. You're going to lead the meeting, she told me, and her confidence in me was contagious. You're the one Frank targeted first, you did the research, and the community needs to see you standing up to him. I'll be there to support you, but this needs to be your fight. Over the next 2 days, Sarah coached me on how to present our case effectively. She helped me organize the evidence for the biggest impact and taught me how to speak with authority. For the first time since this whole mess began, I felt like I had some control. I'm not the same guy who backed down over a flower pot, I told her the night before the meeting. You're not, she agreed. You're ready to lead this. The change in me in just a few days was incredible. I had gone from someone who avoided confrontation to someone ready to face down a dangerous bully in front of our entire community. Sarah's training had given me the skills, but her belief in me had given me the confidence. As we prepared for the meeting, I knew Frank Miller had made a huge mistake. He thought he could scare us into leaving, but instead he had awakened a strength in both of us that he was not ready for. The next day, we would find out if our preparation was enough to finally end his reign of terror. Can an ordinary guy really take down a bully who has scared away multiple families? Drop a heart if you're cheering for him. The emergency HOA meeting was held in the community center on a Thursday night. The room was packed. It was the biggest turnout anyone had seen in years. Word had gotten out that something major was happening. Frank Miller sat in the front row, looking as confident as ever, with Carolyn Vance and the other board members who had protected him for over a year by his side. It was ironic that he was at a meeting where the very people he tried to silence were about to bring him down. As I stood at the front of the room, I saw all the faces of my neighbors, some curious, some supportive, and a few who looked hostile. I felt like I was standing up for every family Frank had scared away. I want to ask Chairman Vance a simple question, I began, and thanks to Sarah's coaching, my voice was steady and clear. Did you check Frank Miller's background before you appointed him to the disciplinary committee? The question seemed simple, but I could see Carolyn's panic immediately. She looked at Frank, then tried to give a vague answer. We always follow proper procedures for all appointments, she said, but she didn't sound convincing. I'm not asking about procedures, I said, pushing forward. I'm asking if you specifically looked into his employment history and the reason he left his last job. The room became very quiet. Everyone realized this was more than just a typical HOA argument. That's when I pulled out the documents that would change everything. Here is Frank Miller's employment record from his previous job, I announced, holding up the papers. He was fired for bullying his co-workers and abusing his authority. That happened in March of last year. He was appointed to our HOA disciplinary committee in May of last year. I let that sink in for a moment. Chairman Vance, you hired a man to enforce our community's rules just 2 months after he was fired for abusing his power. Did you know about his history, or did you fail to do a background check on someone you gave authority over our entire neighborhood? Carolyn's face turned white. She knew she had no good answer. The room started murmuring as people realized what had happened. Frank Miller, who had been so smug, finally started to look stressed. His face was red, and he was clenching and unclenching his hands as he saw his power slipping away. These are lies and accusations. Frank finally shouted, but his voice was desperate. This man is just trying to discredit me because I caught him breaking the rules. But it was too late. The community had heard the evidence and seen the proof. That's when Sarah, who had been sitting in the back, stood up to deliver the final blow. Frank isn't the only problem, she announced, her cold, authoritative voice cutting through the noise. The problem is a system that covers up dangerous behavior instead of dealing with it. She walked to the front of the room with the confidence of someone who was used to being in charge. What you've just learned about Frank's employment history is disturbing, but it's not the worst thing he's done. The room fell silent again as Sarah stood next to the laptop we had set up. For the past week, Frank Miller has been stalking my family. He has trespassed on our property multiple times, tried to enter our home illegally, and yesterday morning, he pointed a loaded gun at me in our backyard. There were gasps from the audience. The video evidence we showed was undeniable. The first clip showed Frank creeping around our house in the middle of the night, testing our doors and windows. The second showed him trying our front door handle. But it was the third video from our backyard camera that left the room in stunned silence. There was Frank Miller pointing a handgun at my wife while she did yoga. The image was so shocking that several people stood up in horror. This is what happens when dangerous people are given authority, Sarah said calmly. And this is what happens when the people in charge of our safety ignore the warning signs and allow abuse to continue. Walter, our elderly neighbor, then stood up to share his story. I've seen Miller stalk 3 other families, he said, his voice shaking but firm. The Hendersons, the young couple on Maple Street, and the family with the twins, they all moved away because of him. We were all too scared to speak up, but after seeing that video, I can't stay quiet anymore. His words opened the floodgates. Other residents started sharing their own stories of Frank's intimidation, and it became clear this was a pattern of abuse that had been going on for over a year. Frank Miller sat in silence as his world fell apart. Carolyn Vance, realizing she was in serious trouble, announced her resignation immediately. The board then voted to remove Frank from all his positions and ban him from the neighborhood. Within a week, Frank was facing criminal charges for stalking, trespassing, and assault with a deadly weapon. The reign of terror in our neighborhood was finally over, not because of violence, but because of truth, evidence, and a community that found the courage to stand up to a bully. What other secrets is Sarah hiding? Smash that subscribe button if you want to hear more stories about my incredibly dangerous wife. 3 weeks later, Sarah and I were sitting on our front porch, enjoying the sight of our blue flower pots. They were back in their original spot, glowing in the afternoon sun, a symbol of our victory. Walter was now the new HOA chairman, and his first act was to get rid of the ridiculous color rule. The neighborhood felt different. People were relaxed, families were staying, and neighbors actually waved to each other instead of looking away in fear. As I sipped my lemonade and watched my wife tend to her flowers, I looked at her with a mix of love, admiration, and just a little bit of healthy fear. Sarah had shown me a side of herself that was more complex and capable than I had ever known. I was still trying to wrap my head around the fact that I was married to a woman who trained elite soldiers for psychological warfare. You know what it's like to find out you married a human weapon. I said, as if speaking to an audience, I recommend you never make my wife angry. Anyone want to argue about the color of flower pots? We're ready to talk about it, Sarah laughed, and it was the warm, genuine laugh of the woman I fell in love with. For a moment, everything was right in our little corner of the world. We find these crazy stories so you can just enjoy them. Like, share, and subscribe, and let BD Stories be your source for the most unbelievable tales.